How was the scientific reasoning homework? The last session that we had, that stuff made sense? Homework made sense? Feel pretty good about it? Okay, good. Glad to hear it. Know that you have an argument analysis draft due tonight at midnight. It's on this vaccine question we were just talking about. Cool. I'm glad to hear that you guys are talking about it with one another. Because the trick here is, like, you want the best possible argument for either side, right? You don't want to, like, get too stuck in thinking that, like, oh, this side is right, and so when you try to think of, like, what's the other side's argument, you end up giving, like, a weak version of their argument. No, you want the strongest version of both arguments so that, like, if your side ends up prevailing, you really feel like I accomplished something. I brought down the best possible argument on the other side. You also want to know, like, maybe the other side's argument is in fact better than mine, and maybe I need to think about changing my mind. These are all important things to have in mind when you're working through this. You want these arguments to be as strong as possible. One argument for one side, one argument for the other side, a third argument that says which of those two arguments was the better argument and why. And this time's a little bit different because in, like, these past argument analysis assignments, I kind of gave you the fuel. I was like, here, look at this, and then tell me, like, which argument is better. Or at least supplied you with one argument. With the dark suckers thing, I said, like, here's the standard light emitting theory, here's the dark sucker theory. This one, I just gave you the problem. You're all on your own to try to figure out what sorts of sources you use in order to dig up the relevant sorts of information to execute your argument. And if you're using sources, perhaps you should also be citing sources. These argument analysis drafts are just drafts. We're going to return to them at the end of the class and help you, like, pick ones that you really want to workshop up. So don't freak out too much if you're just like, I'm not sure if I'm doing things right just yet. Like, we're getting around to it. We're going to try to, like, have some time for you to revisit these and try to tune them up a little bit more. We just want to first pass at it for now. What was I saying? I was talking about something. I just completely lost track of my train of thought. Does that ever happen to you guys? It's embarrassing when it happens in front of a crowd of people. So anyway, that's an assignment. You want to make sure that you do it. Oh, right. So yeah, that's due Friday night. And in addition to that, next week is going to be kind of interesting and busy. We're due for an exam. So I'll probably post another exam. I want to make sure that you have the whole week to do it. Let's knock that out before spring break. That way, the deadline for dropping the course, which is next Friday, maybe you get some idea of whether you really want to drop the course before the deadline. So yeah, if we can sneak an exam in there before then, awesome. Today we're going to be talking about experts and expertise. Yesterday we were talking about, not on Wednesday, we were talking about scientific reasoning. On Monday, we're going to be talking about reliable sources and kind of evaluating sources. And in the spirit of our conversation today about experts and expertise, I decided to try to find some experts on evaluating sources. So I went to the folks at the library. They seem like they're pretty good at, like, managing and cataloging information. They're going to come in on Monday, and they're going to talk to us about evaluating sources. Wednesday, we're going to talk about the news media and why you should never trust them. No. Why you should sometimes why you should always trust them. Why you should trust them when they're trustworthy and don't trust them when they're not trustworthy. That's the way to do it, right? The trick is figuring out when is which case. What's one case, what's the other? How do you know when a generalization is good? How do you know when an explanation is good? This class is all about the tools, like the tests that you run to tell, like, is this kind of argument a good argument? So we'll be talking about media and the fake news crisis, and then and maybe we'll do something on Friday before spring break too. Maybe. We'll see how you're feeling. So let's start with this question today. I know this is going to be the topic of conversation on... Oh, I remember what I was going to say when I spaced out. If you're citing sources on this argument analysis draft, or if you're using sources on this argument analysis draft, maybe you should cite them. I'm only going to be grading this for completion. The final draft, like once you've had a chance to work it up, if you're using outside sources, I'm definitely going to want to make sure that, like, you cite your sources there. On the draft, maybe I'm less impressed with it. But why should you cite sources? My guess is, like, your teachers have been telling you to cite your sources for a long time, right? What's the big deal? Have you ever kind of gotten the impression that, like, it's not that big a deal? Because plagiarism, right? Yeah, because plagiarism. Who the hell cares about plagiarism? Why is plagiarism bad? Yeah, the university cares. Yeah. Are you going to care at all about citing your sources after you leave an academic context? Because there's one version of this. There's one version of this that's about like honesty and honor or something like this. Like we might even think about this like plagiarism is has something to do with intellectual honesty. It has something to do with intellectual property as well. It's stealing people's ideas. That's what's wrong with plagiarism. You stole somebody else's idea. Who cares about that? Like I get like where I care about it. And other academics might care about it because we make our careers on the originality of our ideas. If somebody steals my idea and like publishes a big book and gets famous, I'm going to be pissed. Like they did not do the work. That was not their, like I should be getting those accolades. But in a conversation, if you're at a party and you're like saying something, you're like, well, actually, blah, 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 and somebody goes like, that's not your own idea. You got that from this other, like the Goodwill Hunting scene, right? Like, who cares? Who cares if you got it from someplace else? Is this really important anywhere else besides in school? Your hand was up and I just kind of steamrolled it.
Well, I was just going to play devil's advocate.
Please do. Yeah, this is how we get the best arguments.
Doesn't knowledge belong to people and that it's information belongs to everybody?
Yeah, sure. That doesn't mean that you can, like, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can represent it as an idea that you came up with on your own, right? Yeah, maybe knowledge does belong to everybody. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have some responsibility to say, like, I got this knowledge from somebody else, and then point it out. I got this knowledge from somebody else. But we get a lot of knowledge from other people. It'd be exhausting to constantly be citing your sources for everything, right? Maybe even have experienced this in writing a paper where you're just kind of like, how much do I cite? Like, I wasn't born with any of this knowledge. I got it all from other people. Do I cite like my grandpa when I was 8 and he like had a talk with me? Like how much is too much? Yeah.
Actually, I know where the whole plagiarism law started.
Ah, cool.
Thanks to art history
Art history.
on Tuesday, actually, my art history class. It was the Hogarth Act of 1735 in Britain. Because William Hogarth was printmaker and painter who was having people steal his prints and make exact duplicates and sell them.
And they were selling it, but it was his property somehow. So it's a property thing, right?
Parliament, so that they would make an act preventing people from essentially any profits gained by others that are copying you.
Yeah.
Are yours to take from them.
Right, so it's about property, right? It's about not profiting from somebody else's labor, only profiting from my own labor. Do you profit? How often do you profit from other people's ideas? No, I mean like get money. Like if I'm like at a cocktail party and I say, actually the Hogarth Act was when like plagiarism, and I don't say like I heard that from one of my students who heard it from like his art history class. I just kind of conceal all that. I'm not going to get paid for that, am I? Some people might hear me and be like, oh, he's smart. But, like, am I profiting from it? Have I violated any laws in that case?
But it mostly applies not to
Yeah.
like something somebody said, but like published work.
A published work, right. This is what, if we're, like, taking a strictly sort of like a property rights approach to plagiarism and to citing sources. But I don't think that's the most interesting reason why we cite sources, do you? That it's all about, like, property law. Maybe it's so that like is that the survey says? Is that the next thing? Yeah. It's maybe these two things, right? I want my interlocutors. I want writers to be transparent in how they came to information. I want to see where they got their information from. Maybe because I want to know like how did you come to this position? Is it a trustworthy route? I might also want to follow up. Sometimes a citation is kind of like a shorthand for like, I don't really have space or time to go into it, but if you want to learn more about this, boop, that's where you go. And this is why when you cite, like one of the most important things is that you're giving your reader a reliable map to where you got the information so that they can go brush up on their own if they want to learn more. Or maybe if they're suspicious of whether or not you got it right. I get lots of students in like my history of philosophy classes that say like, Plato says yakety schmackety, and I'm like, really? That doesn't sound like Plato at all. Where does he say that? If you just say Plato says, I'm kind of like I haven't read all the dialogues. Like maybe he does say it somewhere and I've like missed it. You got to give me an address. You got to show me like where to find it, so that I can check to see if you've interpreted the source well, and maybe so I can follow up and learn more. Yeah.
I think that citations help improve arguments and back your own claims. If you have Harvard in your citation, then it's going to be better.
Yeah, there's something also about citations. It lends more authority to my claim, right? If I just write something down, or if I just say it, if I just make a claim, somebody might be like, well, why should I believe you? But if I say Harvard scientists say so too, now everyone's like, whoa, that counts for more. It lends more authority. It lends more believability to my claim when I cite my sources. So long as my sources are actually good, though, right? The sources have to be the sorts of things that'll bring that credibility. So yeah, it lends our claim. We did it almost in exactly the order that I predicted. It's almost like I'm an expert in having this conversation. So yeah, lends our claims more authority. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about experts and appeals to authority. Because there's something really interesting going on when I make this sort of argument. I kind of flagged it when folks were doing it with generalizations. They try to do a generalization by saying 60% of A's are B's. And we go like, all right, so what's the evidence? What's the justification for your claim that 60% of A's are B's? And they say, because scientist over there says 60% of A's are B's. And I'm like, ooh, that's not a generalization. That's an appeal to authority. What's doing the work in justifying your claim there is because that person said so. And the interesting thing about that move is, like, apparently it's not enough for me to say so. Like, when I say so, nobody's impressed. But when that person says so, everyone's like, oh, listen up. There's something about some people's believability just because of who they are. Kind of, sort of. We want to make sure, like, some people might be thinking to themselves, like, I thought we talked about this. I thought we talked about talking about the person making the argument instead of the argument that they make. That's an ad hominem fallacy. It's a fallacy when it's irrelevant, right? When the character of the person making the argument is not relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn. When it is relevant, on the other hand, it can be a very important tool. Why do I trust experts? Something about who they are makes them trustworthy. This is what makes expertise tick. Let's start just by recognizing that, like, there seems to be this myth. I don't know how many people actually believe this seriously. There seems to be this myth that, like, some folks think they can just think for themselves. They don't believe anything because somebody else tells them to. In fact, that's a terrible way to go through life. Just trust in what other people tell you. You need to, like, think for yourself at all times. Be an independent thinker. Can we all agree, like, nobody can do that? That's like a crazy fantasy. We all rely on other people's judgments all the time. It's a part of, like, how we're social creatures and how we're kind of social knowledge producers. Some people are just more trustworthy than other people, and when they say something, I believe them. It's perfectly reasonable to trust experts if they're legit experts. If they are, in fact, experts, it's perfectly reasonable to trust them. It might, in fact, be unreasonable to not trust them. But we want to be careful about really kind of like careless and ungrounded appeals to authority. I think it's good to be a little nervous about putting your trust in somebody else's judgment. And the thing that we're going to try to navigate here today is like, well, how do I figure out what it is that makes these things believable and rational? What is it that an appeal to expertise needs in order to be a good appeal to expertise? And what are the things that make it bogus reasoning? What are the times that I should not be trusting in expert authority? So, the key to, like, expert, if we're going to take like an etymological approach to this even, we might note that, like, expert comes from the Latin expertus, and it's like got the same root there as the word experience. And this is exactly what an expert is. An expert is somebody who has relevant experience, or they have relevant background knowledge. The interesting epistemic thing, the interesting thing about, like, you know, like how we approach our beliefs that experts have that makes them very different than everybody else. Because on the one hand, we have the experts, the people with the relevant experience who know when they say things, we listen to them and we believe them. And on the other hand, there's everybody else. There's the laity, the lay people who don't have that necessary experience. And when they make claims, we ask them to justify themselves. If this kind of goes back to that everyone's entitled to their own opinion stuff, like when some asshole on the street says X, I'm totally entitled to say, what are your reasons for X? If I'm going to take that claim, that X, seriously, I'm going to need to hear your reasons. But the thing about an expert is we don't ask them for their reasons. This is like the heart and soul of expertise. So when the expert says so, you don't go like, oh yeah, prove it. When the expert says so, the mere fact that they said so is maybe not enough to get you to completely believe them, but it's a reason. It moves you in that direction. Does that make sense? I got like a booger or something? Everybody's just like, okay. What we're dealing with here is when we're trying to think about what is it that makes appeals to expertise work well and what makes them work poorly, is we might also recognize that we have kind of tendencies to err on one side of this or the other. Sometimes we can be too gullible. We can trust so-called expert authority too readily and get burned by that. That's a thing that happens, and we should be careful about that, and we should talk about, we'll talk about this crisis of gullibility. On the other side, though, I want to make sure that we temper this conversation about being too gullible when you trust experts with this recognition that there's such a thing as being way too cynical and being not trusting enough when it comes to experts. We're going to talk about both of these. Let's start with the gullibility crisis, where sometimes we fall prey to unqualified appeals to appeals to unqualified authority. We talked about this when we were looking at fallacies. We marked it as a type of inductive fallacy of weak induction, an appeal to an unqualified authority. And obviously, an unqualified authority is not somebody that you should trust, right? It's right there in the name. They're unqualified. What makes somebody qualified versus unqualified? What makes somebody an expert? Education, specialization, relevant experience. Relevant background knowledge. When it comes to education, we might say something like, what's valuable about the education, by the way, is the relevant background knowledge that you get in getting the education. It's not the piece of paper at the end, right? It's not like, I have a diploma, therefore I'm more trustworthy. We'd be like, diplomas don't make you trustworthy. Knowledge makes you trustworthy. Experience makes you trustworthy. Diplomas are frequently a sign that you've got the knowledge, but we all know people, right? They're not in class because they're not in class anytime. Like, there are folks who manage to get diplomas that they didn't learn shit. We try to weed them out, but they're sneaky. They're good at acting like they're learning. Sometimes I think if they put as much effort into learning as they did into acting like they were learning, they might find that it's easier to just learn stuff. So, appeals to unqualified authority. That was a tangent. Like, where did that come from? Rosenfeld is salty today. Appeals to unqualified authority. Let's start with this. Let's see an example of an appeal to unqualified authority. One of the easiest places to go with this is usually advertising. So
all these seem the same.
Get a Sony. The technology in their cameras and camcorders makes it...
What kind of camera should I buy? Justin Timberlake says I should buy a Sony. Is he a relevant authority on this? Does he have any expertise? What does he know about cameras? Well, he's got lots of experience with cameras. People take pictures of him all the time. Is he trustworthy? Not a qualified authority on what camera I should buy? Why not? Thought he had lots of experience with cameras.
He doesn't know like the logistics of how they work.
He doesn't know how they work? Do I need somebody who knows how a camera works to tell me what sort of camera I should buy?
He doesn't know the mechanisms of how, what they do with the difference. He doesn't know the details about it.
He doesn't know the details, yeah, or his experience doesn't give him those details, right? He's experienced in being on the side of the camera that, having his picture taken with a camera, but not necessarily. Does he have to know the features of the camera? Is somebody who did know the features of the camera, maybe I read the camera manual, and I know all the features of the camera. Does this make me an authority now? would you trust me if I said you should buy a Sony and you said why? And I said, because I read their manual and I know all the features of the Sony cameras.
I mean, features are part of everything more.
You need to know, you need to know about all the other cameras too in order to make an evaluation.
So if I read all the camera manuals, then I would be an authority on which camera you should buy.
You also have like picture takes and the quality of the photos, and you have to know like
How would I get that stuff? Experience not through having my picture taken with the camera, but being the person who takes the pictures, because presumably I'm buying my camera so that I can take pictures. Is that right? Maybe we need more information. Maybe Justin Timberlake says, like, I'm an authority. People take my picture all the time. And I go, perfect, actually, because I'm buying this camera for other people to take a picture of me. And I want to know what camera is the best from this side of the camera. I don't know if there really is much of a difference. But yeah, that seems a little bit silly. It seems like I'm buying the camera because I want to take pictures, so I want to talk to somebody who has taken pictures. The first guy, by the way, I don't even know his name. I was told in the last class that he's actually a famous photographer. The first guy who said, you should buy a Sony, and he said it with an accent. Is that what you were going to say? Oh. That guy is actually a professional photographer. When he says, I should buy a Sony, now is their expert authority.
Yeah, but nobody cares.
Yeah, but nobody cares?
Nobody didn't anybody care. When he said, okay,
Oh,
anybody know that
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Not nobody cares about this stuff. Okay. Like nobody cared
when he
that
said
like the
that-
professional photographer said you should buy a Sony. They only cared when JT chimed in.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, nobody cared. So
Well, then those people seem a little bit silly, right? Because like that guy seems to have the relevant experience. Maybe. Maybe not. Yes.
I was just going to ask, wouldn't it be fun to do the whole question because you have some
That's right. Maybe that standard is when you're talking about standard, you mean like it seems like I want to be able to use this camera for very specific things, right? So that information is important. The person who tells me which camera I should buy should be somebody who has relevant experience with that. And maybe in this case, somebody who's a professional photographer, maybe they are not the best person to tell me what camera what to buy. Have you ever had like that sort of experience where you ask somebody for advice about like what to buy and you're like, I have to buy this thing and it's expensive, so I want to make sure I get a good one. And so you ask the person who's like way into this thing, which one should I buy? And it turns out like they are not helpful at all. I'm having this go on right now with I'm like trying to put a stereo together. Like first time in my life, I'm like, I'm gonna have a nice hi-fi stereo. And I have a friend who's like way into stereos, and I asked him like, what sort of stereo should I put together? And he says, starts kind of going through all these components, and is like, you should get this, and you should get this, and you should get this. And I'm on Amazon checking prices. Like this is a $3,000 stereo that he's telling me to put together, and I'm like, dude, no. Like, I can't do, like, my wife will not let me have a $3,000 stereo, and she's right to not let me. That's wasting money. My ears cannot tell the difference between a $1,000 stereo and a $3,000 stereo. Or if they could, like, I don't know that I want to train myself to make that distinction anymore. Like, I want to be satisfied with the 1,000, like 800. Can we do this for under 800? And my friend is like, I can't do it for under 800. And I'm like, well, then you don't have the relevant experience to help me with my problem, which is how do I put together an $800 stereo? You got relevant experience with that crazy shit over there. And I'm sure he gets a tremendous amount of pleasure from his $3,000 stereo. Me, I'm feeding orphans with the leftover money, so I feel good here. There were a bunch of hands that I kind of plowed over. Nope. Do we get what's going on with this appeal to unqualified authority? We want to make sure that the expertise that's being claimed is actually experience and knowledge that's relevant to the case at hand. This is a great big argument by analogy going on, right? Somebody claims expert experience, and we say, like, in what scenarios? And they say, these scenarios. And we say, is that relevantly similar to the scenario that we're wondering about? If it is, bingo, then we have maybe something like a generalization or an application of a statistical syllogism or an argument by analogy. It's just some sort of inductive inference on the basis of somebody's track record and experience. Cool? Cool. That's my gullibility crisis. We also have the cynicism crisis, wherein people are not trusting enough about experts. And I got to be honest, just kind of like cards completely on the table. there is a kind of striking surge in cynicism about expertise that's been going on for the last couple of years. And in the last 1 year, perhaps, we might have noticed that it has made its way to some surprisingly high places in our society, including like some of the highest ranks of our government. So this kind of skepticism, if I was being polite, outright hostility, if I wanted to grind an axe, to like the idea that there are experts who know more stuff than everybody else. Like, this is an important aspect of the sorts of political conversations that are happening in our democratic communities right now. It is important that we are able to navigate sorts of conversations where somebody says, we should trust the experts, and somebody else says, like, no, we shouldn't trust the experts. So, too much, oh yeah, sorry.
I heard somebody say that it's better, because he was defending not trusting the experts.
Defending not trusting the experts, yeah.
He would say that it's better to have no credit than bad credit.
Better to have no credit than bad credit. The experts have bad credit. They have a track record of getting things wrong. For that, if somebody has a track record of getting things wrong on an issue, then maybe they're not a good authority, right? Maybe they don't actually have the relevant experience. Maybe making all those mistakes is what gives them like this. I don't know about you, like I get a whole lot of experience and knowledge. Like I get like all the character building experiences of my life or times that I made mistakes. I learn a lot from mistakes. I wish I was better at learning from other people's mistakes. I kind of tend to have to make the mistakes myself. My little sister, she was good at learning from other people's mistakes, mostly mine. But like me, I seem to have to make them all myself. That's a bummer. But yeah, so maybe we could say that. Maybe we want to make sure also that we're not falling prey to the science is a liar sometimes thing that we saw at our last meeting too, right? Where we might say like they've made mistakes, but like in the process of like recognizing the mistake and kind of superseding it, this is what gives them the sort of credentials and authority that an expert really deserves. There are plenty of other things that are at work here, so I want to kind of pick out some common tropes that are, I go so far as to say, like not respectable. They're like big problems for people getting too cynical about expertise. So we can start here with mistrust of motives. This is Rick Perry. He is now our Secretary of Energy, a position that was previously held, and the last two occupants of that position were Nobel Prize-winning physicists. When he was running for president in 2008, I believe, then Governor Perry said we should not trust the data that's coming from climate scientists that's showing us that the Earth is warming, and says that a substantial number of scientists have manipulated the data to keep grant money rolling in. Mistrust of motives. I don't trust these scientists because I think that they have a dog in the fight. I think that they're not trustworthy. I think that they're being kind of led by their desire for money, and therefore their testimony, when they publish their data, it's not honest. It's not something that's trustworthy. Yes? I don't know if they were physicists. At least one of them, I think, was a physicist. I think they were both Nobel Prize winners. He was the governor of Texas. Well, that's maybe a very important job.
Yes.
You get all kinds of experience being the governor of a large state.
Yeah, but what does he know about anything?
Oh.
Anything like that? Something relevant to what he's actually doing?
I don't know. This would be a conversation to have. We have lots of stuff to talk about, though, so I don't necessarily want to pick apart, like, I don't want to necessarily pick apart Secretary Perry's, I would like to, but like, not necessarily as part of class. His expertise for this position. If you thought, by the way, that one of the big problems with the with the Department of Energy is that it needs to be dismantled. Yeah, if what you want to do is get rid of the agency, maybe you pick somebody who's got a different sort of expertise. Yes?
Isn't that the ad hominem fallacy?
What's that?
The ad hominem?
Ad hominem to the person. Yeah, but maybe it's a genetic fallacy, perhaps, and maybe it's justified. This is the sort of thing that like we would say somebody's not automatically wrong because they're biased or because they have a dog in the fight, but maybe they're less trustworthy. And expertise, after all, is not about like, oh, I assume that you're right. It is a little bit about that. It's about trusting somebody, right? And maybe somebody's trust gets eroded if I think that they have a bias. if I have good reason to be to have mistrust of their motives. I have reason to be mistrustful of their motives. So yeah, this is totally an important thing. But can we see how you can go like way too far with it? And just for the record, like this like sweet grant money that's rolling in, like I don't know if any of you guys know any like professional academic scientists. They're not wealthy. They're not making tons and tons of money. I do know who's publishing a lot of the data that tries to undermine the like basic climatological consensus, and those are people that stand to make an awful lot of money from convincing us that like there is no climate change. Folks who have interests in, I don't know, like fossil fuel industries, right? Same way that the expert science that was being funded by the tobacco industry that showed that like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be so fast to suppose that cigarette smoking is a cause of cancer. Maybe we have good reason to say like, well, I don't know if I trust their expert testimony. I think they're biased. They're being funded by the tobacco industry. That is a good reason to be suspicious of somebody's authority. There is such a thing as like being too mistrustful of other folks, and there's such a thing as like not applying that sort of skepticism evenly, right? Not recognizing that like, this isn't really much of a bias. And in fact, the folks who are making the arguments on the other side, they have a much bigger bias if we're really concerned about that sort of thing. So watch out for this. Watch out for this dismissal of experts because you think that the experts are just out there. They'll lie to you in order to line their own pockets. I hear people talk like this an awful lot, and that might be true in certain circumstances, but shit, man, I would need some compelling evidence to believe that. And what I've seen mostly from scientists is that they ain't lining their pockets with much of anything. Okay, mistrust of motives. In the good company of Secretary Kerry, we have, which insane clown posse member is this? I forget his name. I'm actually not embarrassed at all that I don't know his name. Are you guys familiar with artists? Yeah, let's call them artists. Musical artists, the insane clown posse. Oh, today's an exciting day for you. And when you get out of class, you hit that YouTube and find out about Insane Clown Posse. Here are some of the, I think, some of the great American song lyrics of our time. In a hit song called Miracles, the Insane Clown Posse says, water, fire, air, and dirt, effing magnets, how do they work? And I don't want to talk to a scientist. Y'all mother effers lying and getting me pissed. Like Yeats. Aside from how weird it is to say mother effers, what's going on here? Have you encountered this sort of attitude before when somebody suggests like, here we have people who are experts and like you should believe the experts? Do you get this impression that sometimes folks they have this like deep-seated anxiety that like who are these experts that think that they're better than me? Are the experts better people than the lay people? Better people? No, probably not. Better judges of like issues in the domain that they have relevant experience in? Yeah. Yeah, totally. That's the whole point, right? So there's such a thing as like getting too wrapped up in these anxieties that like other people think they're better than I am. Like some people are better at things than I am. At some things, right? The things that they have relevant experience with, the stuff that they have expertise in. Yes, they are more trustworthy, they are better judges. We just need to get over that. So we have mistrust of motives can make us too cynical when it comes to experts. This anxiety about elitism, this is silly too. Let it go. Other people know more shit than you do about some things. Like, it's actually nice. That means you don't have to know all the things yourself. You can rely on other people. Some people don't like that, relying on other people. It's just, I don't know, it's a fact of who we are. We're social. Really should change this slide because I don't feel comfortable making fun of Katt Williams these days. He's not doing too well. I don't want to kick the guy when he's down, but no, he's not. Well, he might be. He's just, yeah, he doesn't seem like he's happy. That's one of the things that bums me out. So I'll poke a little fun at Katt Williams with the asterisks that like I feel a little bit bad about it. This is from one of Katt's stand-up specials. He says, we're too old, we're too smart, we're too good to believe stuff that Doesn't make no effing sense. You're too old to be believing in evolution. This is, I'd like to call this sort of brand of cynicism seems to be something about like, it doesn't make sense. The experts say all this stuff, but that doesn't make sense to me. So like, to hell with the experts. Call this enchantment with my own ignorance. Doesn't make sense to me, therefore it doesn't make sense. As if it's just impossible that one of the reasons why it doesn't make sense is that I just haven't understood it yet. And this is one of the things, if I had a conversation with Katt Williams about something like this, I'd ask him like, how hard did you try to make sense of a theory of evolution? Did you like go find all of the people who study this stuff and all say like, that's a pretty good theory? Did you say like, can you explain it to me in a way that I can understand? We saw this recently with Kyrie Irving too. This kind of like the Earth is flat. I know all the experts say that the Earth is round, but like that just doesn't make any sense to me. They're lying. And like, well, how hard did you try? Sometimes stuff just doesn't make sense to me because like I haven't understood it yet, and it takes work. Sometimes you need to have that experience in order to understand it. So we shouldn't let this kind of weigh us down either. And if we can have enchantment with our own ignorance. We can also have an enchantment with our own superficial understanding of a topic. Y'all know a journalist? Yeah, let's call her a journalist. Named Nancy Grace?
Nancy Grace, every night at 8 Eastern.
HLN, News and Views. Tonight, amid
Check out this segment with Nancy Grace.
just in the air there in Japan, but now in a food.
Do we even really need to go into like a whole lot of detail about what, like this question? So what was wrong with Nancy Grace? Like that's a deep question. That conversation goes on for quite some time, and I'm genuinely curious about this. But like in that exchange, like there was this unbelievable arrogance, right? That like I know a little bit of stuff, therefore like my opinion about like how radiation will travel via wind and water currents across the ocean is as valuable as a meteorologist's.
She even implied that this governor of California knew more.
Than the meteorologist as well, right? So why did the governor of California declare a state of emergency? Because like politicians have never declared a state of emergency for political purposes before, right? So this is, this was the staggering arrogance involved there that seems to like start with this like, I know a little bit of stuff, therefore like I'm a genius. This is like, so many internet arguments are like somebody who's like, I know a little bit of stuff, therefore I'm a genius. My opinion counts as much as an expert's does. This is also a really big problem. This is what gets us to not trust experts, because we say like they say something different than me and I know better because look at all the stuff that I know. This is kind of the other side of the coin from what Katt Williams was doing. This kind of like I don't understand what the experts are saying, therefore they must be wrong. All right, so that's our gullibility crisis, a cynicism crisis. We want to be somewhere in between, right? And we have this question, what sort of appeals are reasonable? I know what I should, I don't want to drift too far this way. I don't want to drift too far this way. I want to be in the middle. I want to trust the right amount and the right sorts of scenarios. So what sorts of appeals would be reasonable? Well, one way of framing this is just as an ordinary inductive inference. We already talked about this a little bit, that it's on the basis of somebody's track record. They've had the relevant experience. Their experience with this type of scenario is such that we would say that like they're in a position to know about what it's likely to be like in some new scenario because they've seen the way that the world has worked. They're privy to all of these patterns. Or maybe they're part of the pattern. Maybe they're making predictions. We can think of an expert as a theory that's been working well for a long time, right? That they make predictions and those predictions keep coming true. So like it just seems like a basic sort of generalized sort of an argument that's a generalization, an argument for a basic inductive sort of argument that I say to myself, like they're probably going to keep being right about this sort of issue, the issue that they have expertise in. Or as we were saying before, we might want to think about it like an argument by analogy. They have experience over here. Is that analogous to the experience in the domain where this question lies? Is it relevantly similar, right? And this is the big question. This is the nasty sort of thing that like has to be parsed out when I have some sort of dispute over whether or not somebody's expertise does actually grant them legitimate authority? Is it relevantly similar to the scenario that we have a problem with right now? And there are two really big challenges to figuring this out. One of the big challenges is what we might call an epistemological challenge. It might stem from the fact that if we've got a crisis on our hands, and if it's if it's a novel crisis, if we haven't seen anything quite like it before, we might be wondering, like, what are the essential features of this phenomenon? We haven't really fully understood this yet. And if we haven't really fully understood it, we're going to have a hard time figuring out what sorts of relevant scenarios, what sorts of other scenarios are relevantly similar. What sorts of people are going to have the relevant experience to be able to come in and like yield good judgments about the scenario that we're looking at now. In addition to that, this idea of like trustworthiness and authority gets tangled up not just in like, do you have the relevant experience, but it gets tangled up in all sorts of political issues as well. Some of which have to do with things like if you have a diploma, we automatically think that you have better and more important sorts of relevant experiences than folks who maybe don't have a diploma, and maybe that's bullshit. Or we might recognize that certain groups just don't get recognized. Their relevant experience, we just tend to not think it's very important. And maybe that's not justifiable. Maybe that's tangled up in other questions of political power. When we're trying to figure out like how it is that we should navigate some sort of scenario where there are competing perspectives on who's got the relevant experience, there are a variety of ways that we can try to manage this problem. There are a variety of ways that we can try to attack it. One of the ways would be to say, one more. Let's just let as many voices as possible into the conversation as we can. Like, if I want to make sure that like all of the relevant experiences are represented, then just like whoever wants to be a part of the conversation, come on in. This means we're going to like let some crackpots in. We're going to have some people as part of this conversation that are not going to know what the hell they're talking about. But we're not going to leave anybody out. And maybe that's the important thing that we want to keep in mind. Don't leave anybody out of this conversation. We want all of the relevantly similar experiences represented. Might call this a liberal approach to like who gets to be a part of the conversation. We could also just as easily have a conservative approach. We might say something like, in other sorts of situations, we might recognize that it's more important to make sure that we're not mucking up the conversation with too many like crackpot theories and people that don't know what they're talking about. Particularly if what we're looking for is like we need to act now. We don't have time to like talk about this forever. Like we need to come to a decision quickly. Then what I want is a smaller number of experts. I maybe will say, I'm going to restrict the size of like the conversation, so I make sure that we don't get any like ridiculous people who don't belong in the conversation in it. And this might mean that I leave some important viewpoints out. We're erring on the other side of this. And obviously, different scenarios are going to call for different sorts of sensibilities. Sometimes we're going to want to be more liberal. Sometimes we're going to want to be more conservative. And obviously, the virtuous mean is somewhere in between too liberal and too conservative when it comes to this question of how many people get to be or ought to be part of a conversation that's reserved for experts. And last but not least, we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to try to run through this really quickly. We have these problems that have to do with situations where it seems like nobody has the relevant experience. There are no experts on these issues. The kind of obvious and trivial cases where we would say there is no expertise would be ones where nobody's ever seen anything like this before. There's nothing even like vaguely analogous. So that's one kind of scenario. There are others that are like way weirder and kind of trickier. In fact, there's a phenomenon that's recently been identified. I think he's a statistician named Nicholas Nassim Taleb. He's identified, or he claims that there's a sort of phenomenon, he calls it a black swan phenomenon, where the unexpected happens. There's like what normally happens, and every now and again there's an exception to the rule. And Taleb says some of these scenarios where we'll get an occasional, like a really rare even, exception to the rule, it's no big deal. In fact, if we're thinking about like black swans, if I think that all swans are white because I've had lots of experience with swans, but they're all white swans, if one day a black swan comes along, like, is that a disaster? No. No. The normal experience seems to like be more important than the abnormal experience when it comes to identifying swan color. But there are some domains where the rare, kind of like out of left field, nobody saw that shit coming, like those moments are way more important than like how things normally work. the risk reward that like comes with attending to those rare moments is way bigger than assuming that things are always going to be normal. One of the big problems with this is that all of those people that have the relevant experience, their judgment, their trustworthiness is based on this supposition that things are going to continue to be normal, right? They have a bias for the normal. We all have a bias for the normal. This is how induction works. This is how we recognize patterns in the world, is we see things as they normally go and we expect that they're normally going to be normal. But if you have an awful lot of that experience, you might have an awful lot of confidence that things are going to continue to be normal. And in those rare occurrences where you're wrong, those might be catastrophes. And we want to be careful about like how confident we get about expertise in those kinds of scenarios. So what sort of scenarios are we talking about? Like military strategy is one that frequently gets talked about with this. You can talk about somebody that's had lots and lots of experience fighting wars. They've been in so many wars. They were in like the last 5 wars. Does that make them experts on this upcoming war? And we might say, the thing about military strategy is that if you like always expect what's normal, the person that like does the surprising thing that nobody's ever seen before, that's what wins wars. Like those are the sorts of things that like completely will turn a tide. What is going on up there? That's really loud, right? Economics is another one where people talk about this. Business and finance, politics seems to be one of these things too, where like suddenly, like if you get a politician that nobody's ever seen anything like them before, all of the experience in dealing with other kinds of politicians, we might say something like, yeah, your bias for the normal is precisely what made you susceptible to this brand new thing that nobody had ever seen before. Does this make sense? That like we can get too comfortable with the idea of people that have relevant experience, and there are at least these certain domains where that might give us a false sense of confidence, and we want to be careful with that. So how can we tell if somebody's an expert? Yeah, there's a whole, whoa, that's a long one. We're not going to be able to cover that. Know that this is still up there on the Prezi. No homework, no worksheet on this. You got enough on your plate with the analysis draft? All right. Okay, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll be packing up my stuff here, or you can send me an email.